Okay, it's perfect. It is recording. So towards digital fluency in higher education, we spoke about that. And we spoke about the 6 elements of proficiency. And then we spoke about what does the online learning tools and technology mean. And we talked about the historical perspective, drawing on Tony Bates elements. And then we spoke about we spoke about the 2021 Horizon reports, those 3 key Horizon report documents, but more specifically the technology in education, in teaching and learning one, right? So that for us, that was quite critical. And we spoke about the social, technology, economic, environmental factors. And then we spoke about the 6 key technology practices that the Horizon report projects as being the key trends: artificial intelligence, blended hybrid learning, learning analytics, micro-credentialing, open education resources, and quality online learning. Then you had to submit an assignment, the first assignment. And as I mentioned, colleagues, I'm not giving you a separate due date for assignment 1. All your assignments can be given to me by 24th of November. I will just grade everything one time. I think it actually helps you as well. Because I know many of you also have other commitments with marking and grading as well. So this might help you. We just submit everything on the 24th, and then I will grade on the 24th. But however, if you are already working with it, please feel free to submit because I am marking for those that have come in. Okay, then to make it easier for your colleagues, instead of emailing to me, also so that you can have a track of this, you simply click on assignment 1, right? So to submit your, for example, to click on this tab will open up the assignment question, and you'll be able to see the assignment question, the rubric as well that will be used. To go back, you simply click back, and it takes you back to the study unit, right? To submit your assignments, colleagues, what I would actually suggest that you do is submit it online. So all you do is simply click on assignment 01 blog, and then it takes you to title 01 assignment. It tells you when the assignment is due and submission, and then you simply add your attachment, submit your attachment as a file. So you upload your file, click on your browser, upload your file. And then on a pledge, colleagues, is simply to say that I've not received any aid. Now, you know that this is typically for online environments to say that this is your work, right? So you just tick the online submission on a pledge and you click submit, and that will immediately capture your assignment onto the platform. So remember, assignment 1, when you're ready, simply click on this, browse, select the file, and attach it onto the system. Okay, now today we move on to a very interesting session, and one that I actually like a lot personally, is because it allows us to really think of the theoretical principles for designing education technology interfaces and its usage. And more specifically, you know, sometimes we many of us are, and also myself included, if we are academics, we specialize in a specific discipline. And sometimes we have the challenge of how do we bring the knowledge or discipline-specific knowledge across in constructive ways that actually speaks to our students. And this study unit actually talks about the theoretical principles of what it means for teaching in an online environment, what it also means for thinking of educational technology integration. And I've highlighted as part of this some of the key things that I think, principles, strategies, trends, that I think are important for you as you start engaging in this space, but also that have really made a mark in the discourse of online education, right? So by the end of this study unit, you should be able to, now you'll find that each of the study units has a set outcomes to actually help us to know where we're going and what we're doing. So at the end of this study unit, you should be able to identify contemporary pedagogical trends in online learning, demonstrate a basic understanding of learning theories in an online learning environment, demonstrate foundational understanding of open education praxis, something that I mentioned a little earlier, and then demonstrate foundational understanding of gamification in teaching and learning, and then explain the importance of big data in higher education environment. Now, these are, as you looked at it, is pedagogy, learning theories, open education praxis, gamification, and big data. So the idea here is to provide you with that really some kind of introduction to these spaces so that you can start unpacking what does it mean for you in your own space. Now, in this study unit, colleagues, what I've tried to do is to give you an idea of the concept, the competencies, but I've also tried to narrow down the activities, the learning activities, and the assessment question for the portfolio so that you can reflect back to what does this actually mean for you in your own institution, right? So that's the goal of this, is to gain the knowledge, but then to critically reflect on what does these trends mean for me in my own institution? Is it applicable? And if it is, how can I use this to leverage where we are going in our own institution? And I've got about 7 core readings as part of this. Now, these readings are not very long readings. These are normal, traditional readings that you'll find in terms of some of these papers are a bit short as well. So you've got the one by Anderson and Drawn on 3 generations of distance education pedagogy, but more specifically how he unpacks what pedagogy means. Then the second one of Anderson, Terry Anderson is one of the leading educational specialists in education technology, and his work is really good. So if you want to see somebody that is actually proactive, that is actually progressive in his thinking, Terry Anderson is really at that forefront of these spaces. And he talks about towards a theory of online learning. That's his second article. And then we look at the article by Pedagogical and Evine on open education, learning design, open pedagogy. And then a close colleague of mine who works at the European Commission, specifically in the Center for Research, Andrea Inamorata dos Santos, and she works specifically with open education practice. And we actually had her a few times delivering some of the talks, and she's also a research associate as part of the unit that I add. But she really is. When we get to that part, you'll see why I appreciate the work that she does, because she comes from a developing context, formerly from Brazil, but she's now based in Spain. But she's able to adapt those type of open principles to a developing context. And I think that is quite critical for us, is that while we see a lot of these European developed countries trends, is how do we apply this in our own context? And I think what she does is she's able to leverage our own experiences from the developing context to speak to that. And then the next article on the model for introduction of gamification to e-learning in higher education. And then we look at big data analysis, some of the promises and pitfalls, and then also the challenges and future directions of big data and artificial intelligence in education. Now, if we look at these 7 articles, you may think this is a lot of reading, but at this stage, colleagues, all I want you to gain is the foundational understanding of it. So there's a lot, you don't need to really go in depth into it. We just want to get the foundation right. Then there's also a book similar to what I gave you the last time, colleagues. There's a book by Tony Bates on additional teaching and learning in a digital age, and she's published in 2019. It's a second edition, but Tony Bates, as I mentioned last week, is one of the key theorists in distance education, online education, teaching in a digital age, and this is an open textbook that he has. So if you're thinking about education technology, this is an ideal resource for you to download. So it's a free ebook off his site, so please download it and have access to that. So let us look at where we are moving today. So firstly, we know that information communication technology tools has really changed the higher education landscape. And one of the things that we know more critically about the space is that while higher education is playing catch up to some extent, because because much of the corporate companies are actually dictating the pace in which technology is advancing. And because this is such a competitive space, it actually means that these corporate companies are pushing out new technologies, new innovations at a much faster pace than we can actually start adapting to, and especially for us in the African context. So we are always playing catch up to these larger trends in technology. But the good thing about it is that it offers us new innovative spaces for us to engage. And I think that's a good one, is the new spaces in higher education. But with these new spaces, colleagues, one of the things that I realize, and as you sit wherever you are in your institution, is that our traditional pedagogical approaches of how we see teaching and learning can no longer be the norm. We can't teach the way we taught before in a technology-driven education space. There must be some critical reflection on our practices, and reflecting back on how we readapt or revise our approaches to fit these changing spaces. So this brings me to the core question in this study unit, colleagues. What are the basic theoretical principles for designing educational technology interfaces and the usage that focuses on needs, motivations, requirements, and practices of the 21st century learner, and ideally to the context in which teaching and learning interaction takes place? So any institution for this matter, right? And the sub-themes that I want to explore as part of this, colleagues, I've chosen five sub-themes, as I mentioned, right? So the first sub-theme is on contemporary pedagogical trends. The second one is on online learning theories, then open education praxis, then gamification in teaching and learning, and then big data in higher education. So let's look at the first one. So to look at the first one, colleagues, these are sub pages, right? So whole, and the reason why I put these as sub pages is we will have a very long flow of information here, which will make it difficult to read. So it was easier to sub-categorize these as themes. So simply click on the tab, and it then opens up the contemporary pedagogical trends for you. The internet is slightly slow today, but it's getting there. Okay. I just want to see quickly if we have any questions. Okay, so I see most of the colleagues are online. Perfect. Use F12. Oh, okay. So please zoom in. Okay, sorry, colleagues. Let me try to get into a bigger screen. So is my screen not visible at all for you? Let's see if I can make it slightly bigger. Okay, I'm hoping that. Let me go back here. Okay, so is that better, colleagues? Is that more visible? Colleagues, the thumbs up, it's better for you to see that. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Sam. Okay, so let's go through contemporary, right? So we are on now contemporary pedagogical trends. So so what I've also done here, colleagues, is I've integrated learning activities, and this is actually good activities, but all the activities actually helps you build towards your assignment, right? So I'm not just giving you learning activities for the sake of filling up the space. The learning activities actually forces you to think about working towards your assignment, right? And this makes it a bit better for you. So the first learning activity 2.1 is a personalized reflection. And why do you think it is important for us to acquire a basic set of pedagogical skills for teaching and learning in an online environment? And so that's something that you need to reflect on, right? And while you're doing this, you can reflect on your own. And all you do is you simply click on the Add Comment tab. It opens up a tab. You post what you want, click Save, and it'll then save it on the screen for you, right? And anybody can read it, and colleagues can also read what you are posting up as well. So part of this activity is just for you to reflect. Is why is pedagogy important for us? And I said this earlier, one of the critical challenges for us in our South African context is that a teaching degree, a teaching qualification, whether it's undergraduate or whether it's a diploma or a certificate, is not necessary for somebody to teach at a university, right? Not necessary to teach at a university, but internationally, when you apply internationally, many of the universities actually require some evidence that you've been trained in pedagogy, that you've been trained in. Okay, sorry, I just want to reply quickly to Timothy. Timothy, it's not your student number, Timothy. You need to when you're logging in, Timothy, you need to use your student email address, the full student email address, right? So type in your full student email address. That means your student number at ... and then the password DUT 2021. Then it'll be working. Okay, thanks, Timothy. So a personalized reflection, why you think is important for us to acquire a basic set of pedagogical skills. And as I said, internationally, many universities actually require, and this is why it's important, the kind of qualification that you are pushing as part of this postgraduate. Many international universities actually require this as being part of your application process. So let's look at defining pedagogy. So we know that the pedagogy has taken different forms over the years. And we have also seen the term employed in different manners. And many people know the most famous work by Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Anybody talks about pedagogy of the oppressed in the South African context always features somewhere. But over the years, pedagogy has always also been readapted. And you're finding concepts such as utagogy, andragogy. And these are different adaptations of how we teach and learn, right? And so what I want you to do in this activity is I've provided a video for you on pedagogy, and you can watch these videos, and these video clips are not very long. So the idea here is to watch these video clips and look at how this video clip specifically defines pedagogy, right? And then provide in the comments tab below, just provide a brief definition of what you understand by the video's understanding of pedagogy, right? Now let's look at the three generations of pedagogy. For this section, colleagues, I want you to look at Anderson and John's article titled Three Generations of Distance Education Pedagogy. And it's an open access education, open access articles. All our stuff are open access, so you're not going to have any challenge to access it. And click on it, download it, and then you'll be able to go through these sections, right? So Anderson and John focus on what he calls the three generations of how teaching pedagogy has been evolved or evolves, right? And he focuses on what he calls the cognitive behaviorist first, then the social constructivist, and then the last one is the connectivist pedagogy. And immediately from connectivist, you can see that the digital terminology comes in quite strongly. But we bother, and in our South African context, we must be honest as well, is that we tend to create our synergies of teaching and learning from all three, in a sense that we do ask for a lot of recall as part of our teaching and learning disciplines. We do ask for social constructivism in some. And as we are now advocating for technology integration and pushing technology integration, we are also advocating for the connectivist approach, which we will unpack just now. So there's no, for me, as I would like to argue, is that we're not in any specific domain as such. We're really trying to advocate a balanced approach between all three in the South African context. And I think for us, the social constructivist is quite critical for us. You can employ technology as part of this as well. But why I say it's quite critical for us, you remember our whole issue of decolonization, of Africanization, of knowledge production comes out from how we construct our knowledge. So this is part of it. And looking at how technology now reinforces that. One of the sessions that the University of I think it's Stanford that is currently hosting is on the digital humanities and the idea of storytelling as part of a knowledge production approach as well. And that comes into social constructivism as well. So you can look at different ways in which storytelling, and this calls about digital storytelling. So I should actually rephrase that, digital storytelling of how narratives captured online, whether it's audio, text, or whatever it is, becomes part of how we construct our knowledge and our discipline knowledge, our activities, etc., through the integration of technology as part of this. And what does it mean for us now to be digital human beings, digital citizens in these spaces? Now, according to John and Anderson, when he talks about education, and he specifically talks about the types of how education has evolved, and more specifically, remember when we talk of the technology integration, his idea is that you still got classroom integration and you still have the flipped classroom as the concept that you might know. But when we talk about students engaging online, distance education, etc., he says that we evolved, right? And his first understanding was that we had the correspondence situation where people should go and post study guides, whatever it is, and people should then study through that mode, right? And then he says that evolved to what he calls mass media, television, radio, and film. And this we see that immediate technology integration. And here you would have had what we call video conferencing. Then you would have had radio stations with channels. Then you would have had even TV stations dedicated. And I can remember at some time, some period where you had dedicated, and I think we still have it in some basic education spaces as well. We have these dedicated TV channels that are preparing students for the grade 12 examination, etc. So that is part of the integration of what he calls mass media. And then he talks about the third phase, the third evolution, which is the interactive technologies. And here he talks about audio, text, video, web, and immersive conferencing, right? And then he talks about intelligent databases, Web 2.0, Web 3.0, semantic web technologies, etc. So he plots these as, they plot this, Anderson and John, as being the evolution of how we see technology in education coming about. Now, it gets a bit more complicated when it comes to here, because what we're now seeing is a complete readaptation of this in terms of artificial intelligence, etc., as we will see coming across shortly when we're discussing the units. But it really is about the tool. Is technology is creating a tool in education to enable us to rethink our teaching and approach, our teaching and learning approach. Then is first one on the cognitive behaviorist perspective, right? So let's look at how he unpacks this, the cognitive behaviorist approach. And the kind of, when you read this article, this reading, you'll see that he kind of unpacks this way. Learners gain learners' attention. So first we gain their attention, then we inform learners of their objectives. We stimulate some recall of previous information. We present some stimulus to the material. We provide learner guidance. Then we elicit performance. We provide feedback, and then we assess the performance, and then we enhance transfer opportunities. So that's the kind of typical recall to cognitive behaviorist approach of recalling, providing information, assessing, creating stimulus, and recalling that information, right? Then is idea of the cognitive learning theory, and he talks about how this cognitive models are based on functions and operations of the brain, similar to the way the computer models were used to describe learning and thinking, right? And he sees this as being part of the recall approach in the earlier part, the first generation, what he calls the first generation of teaching in an online space. And then he goes on to the second one, he calls the social constructivist pedagogy. And here he talks about synchronous and asynchronous. Now, for those that missed the orientation, synchronous means in real time, in live time, like what we are having now, and the conversations that you are able to chat on immediately on the Teams chat or on the platform itself, the course platform. That's synchronous, right? So we're chatting with each other, we're seeing each other, we're talking to each other in real time, right? Then this asynchronous means that it's delayed time. So for example, you can post a comment on the chat and you can watch this recording a little later. So that's asynchronous opportunities, right? And he talks about this being creative interactions between and among students and teachers, the rethinking of how we communicate, redefining lecturer presence as part of this creates this opportunity for what he calls the second generation, which is the social constructivists, right? But here he talks also more strategically on the nature of knowledge, how it is created. Does the teacher, the educator, just transmit knowledge as in generation one? And he argues against that. He says it moves much, much more further beyond that. We're now working with students to construct knowledge. That may not necessarily be in all disciplines, because there are some disciplines, for example, in the natural sciences, that you still have that full recall that is needed. But there are some disciplines that also as this kind of constructive partnering. And the terminology used here is the shift from the sage on the stage, the person who assumes to know all the knowledge, standing on the stage and presenting verbally or to the student, to now creating spaces in which you facilitate the development of knowledge itself, right? And he talks about new knowledge as building upon foundation of learning. Context is key for the colleagues for Anderson and Drawn in shaping knowledge. Then learning as an active rather than passive process, right? A learning environment, learning centered, learning management systems, for example, metacognition evaluation as a means to develop learners' capacity to assess their own learning. And there's an important concept here that is now emerging in these spaces that is called non-grading. And I don't know if you heard of that concept of non-grading, but something that you should actually Google up, because the idea of non-grading is quite interesting, and the way it's now pushing learners to move beyond just grading themselves, but really thinking of assessing their learning competencies as opposed to a grading element. And then knowledge needing to be subject to social discussion, validation, and application in real world context. This is what he terms the social constructivist approach towards education, and how this happens in the online space. And now this is the third one, colleagues, and something that I've written a bit on this, the connectivist pedagogy in education, but more specifically within my own discipline and what it means for us. And he talks about the connectivist approach. And here he draws on George Siemens and Stephen Downes' idea of connectivist theory, right? And they argue that learning is a process of building nodes of information, and nodes means points of contact. For example, if I had to ask you to provide me information on what it means what does connectivism mean, for example, you would immediately go to Google. You will search connectivism. And when you search connectivism, you will then find YouTube videos. You will then find blogs. You will then find people that wrote. As you tap into, for example, YouTube, into an online journal, into different people that are in the space, those are nodes of information that you are connecting with, right? And Siemens and Downes talks about building nodes as part of this information. It actually is quite interesting because he talks about if we want to learn something in our contemporary era, we don't have encyclopedias. We don't have those kind of elements where you go and you turn into those traditional ways that we were engaging. We now have a quick search, And the quick search connects us to different spaces that we now tap into. And one of the things that we will do in the next study unit is the idea of how you develop your own personal learning network, right? And this theory is quite good for me because what it does is it also allows us, one of our things is to think about how does technology enable the indigenous knowledge systems or production of indigenous knowledge. And one of the things that this actually leads to is how do we create spaces for people that are on the periphery of these power discourses of creating knowledge to now use technology to produce different types of knowledge in these spaces that we have. So for example, if somebody is equipped with a mobile device and a camera facility, and what we find now in typical spaces, people are using now, for example, TikTok and Instagram and the rest of it to communicate certain elements. But what happens if these are tools that are now used to enable people to communicate, for example, rituals that are being performed? Or the way, for example, a farmer is dealing with drought elements. Those are key things that are now technology is enabling that production of knowledge and bringing people that were once at the periphery of power discourse of knowledge construction to now be at the center of these knowledge discussions. And this is what Stephen and Downs talks about, is the enabling factor. And I think that's quite critical for us, is the enabling factor of technology. But remember, colleagues, while we are pushing the enabling factor of technology, you recall our conversation last week was the digital divide. Does it actually increase the digital divide when we start advocating for such technology? So you remember the two sides of the coin that we are talking about as well. So this is quite interesting about Downs' approach. And I had opportunity of actually hearing him a few times at UNISA when we invited him. And he's really profound in the way he wants to unpack, or the way he's theorizing the human element in the connectivist theory, but also the digital element. So it's key role players. But he actually talks about what is actually positioned in Bruno Latour's active network theory, is people becoming actors in this network that we're working with, right? And for example, if you recall anything, like for example, if something happens, a mass, if you remember the kind of some kind of natural event or some kind of catastrophic event where a crisis emerges, people start to take videos of it and start sharing that information. They may not necessarily be reporters, they may not necessarily be cameramen, but these are literally resources that are now being shared. If I'm thinking, for example, of a recent just last week, one of the members in a community, a young girl was shot by two passing gangs. And the use of technology, when people captured that particular moment, allowed police to now network across and piece the information together. And they became part of the production of rethinking that event, a crisis event. And we find the same thing that happens in critical situations. For example, when the people stormed the White House during Trump's time, and how people and how the government were able to piece information from those videos that came out. So the idea of empowering the normal citizen, and I always ask this question: what does the fourth industrial revolution mean for an ordinary South African citizen? And there's an element of empowerment to those that have access, right? And this is what Downs talks about and Siemens talks about, is when they push and advocate this connectivist theory, is how we need to rethink the tools of the connectivist theory, but also the people behind them as actors as part of this network. So when you get colleagues onto this, you will see that there's a video by Siemens, a short video. This is actually quite a short video where he unpacks what it means to be the learning theory of the connectivist approach, right? We then go on to look at one activity as part of this. So in this discussion, all I want you to do here, colleagues, is look at the three generations of teaching and learning, and then of pedagogy, and then simply says what is the cognitive, the social, and teaching presence for us in our group. What do we mean by the cognitive, social, and teaching presence in these spaces? Okay, so that goes the first theme down. Let's look at the second theme. So the second theme now looks more specifically at learning theories. And we foreground, we also revert back to Anderson and John as the key thinkers in the space. Okay, just waiting for this to go back. Okay, so let's go to the second one. Okay, second one, online learning theories. Okay, and the article here, remember, we're still looking at Anderson and John, right? And here their idea is they focus on the learning context, but also what it means to develop a deeper and more useful theory for online learning. And Anderson argues for three main elements. He says it helps us in envisioning of new worlds, how education can take advantage of developments in technology sphere. Secondly, it talks about good theory that helps us to make things, invest our time, limited resources more strategically. And this becomes quite important when we think of institutions that have limited resources. And this came out quite critically when we had the COVID-19 impact, when we had institutions that didn't have learning management systems, institutions that had lack of basic infrastructure, server capacity, etc. So what does it mean for us as we talk about learning theories to invest in those institutional structures that actually speaks to this, right? And then good theory to build on current knowledge and force us to engage in the unknown. So the attributes of learning, and as we start to think of technology, and he shifts this, right? And you know, the normal process was to think of the learner at the center and everything revolves at the learner, right? And he kind of shifts this, says there needs to be a learner-centeredness, there needs to be a knowledge-centeredness, there need to be a community-centeredness. And community-centeredness means community of participants, creating community of learners, right? And assessment-centered. So this is quite interesting for me because what he does is actually talks about a reversal of how many of us have conceptualized our learning worlds. In a sense that many of us see the interaction of the student being at the center and everything else revolving around the student. And he says, no, but that can't happen. Because when we design our content, we design the learner in engagement with the content, engagement with the community, engagement with an assessment. So there needs to be a correlation between these different elements, right? Learner-centeredness includes this implies the learner getting to know the content. If you have tutors a part of the system or teaching assistants, it means part of that student's prior knowledge as well. Knowledge-centered, the content, effective learning, making use of considerations, epistemology, language, context of discipline taught. Assessment-centered also means the kind of technology that we use to provide feedback to our students, our educators. And community-centered includes a critical social component of the learning. And this is the one thing that technology has enabled us to do, is to extend our teaching and learning environments to create online community of learners for those that have access and are able to participate in these things. And then he talks about the interactions in an online learning environment. And he talks about the function of learning-based learner control, facilitating the program adaptation of the learner input, allowing for various forms of participation and communication, and aiding meaningful learner. Now, this is quite an interesting diagram because it talks about the different elements, right? So you got the teacher, you got the content, and you got the learner. And it shows how, for example, the cycle works, where the teacher engages with the learner engages with the content, the teacher engages with the content. So there's this kind of three-way engagement between this. And this is when we work in the digital space that we talk about this. And the one thing that the idea of creation and integration of education technology as part of it is that it allows us to be current, right? And this is one of the biggest issues that are facing many institutions. How do we ensure that our curriculum is current all the time? And technology actually allows us to ensure that by allowing us that flexibility to adapt our current all the time, our case studies, our scenarios, etc. The model for online learning, and here Anderson illustrates the human effects, the student, the knowledge content interactions, and the teacher. And this diagram is quite important, colleagues, because it talks about the idea of how this happens. So if we look at the student-student interaction with asynchronous, the student content interaction of how they search, they retrieve, the tutorial, simulation, virtual labs, ebooks, etc., and how the student engages with the content, asynchronous and the synchronous. This concept always comes out. And if you recall, if you read the 2021 Horizon reports, synchronous and asynchronous, COVID-19 has forced us to really foreground these issues of asynchronous and synchronous technologies, right? And then also simulation environments, specifically in the natural sciences, virtual labs, communities of inquiry, extension beyond the classroom to now online spaces, and then structured learning resources, which we will talk about a little later. So this diagram, this model that Anderson proposes as part of the learning theory is quite an interesting way for us to think about when we talk about instructional design. And remember, part of us looking at educational technology integration is also about thinking very carefully of what we mean by instructional design, right? So those kind of instructional design elements that now comes to the fore, okay? Then there's a learning activity, colleagues, which I want you to do here. And the comments tab below briefly discuss why you think the above online interactions are a critical part of instructional design approach in online education. So think, for example, colleagues, and I force you to think back into your own institutional context. Why is, for example, do we need student content interaction, student teacher interaction, student interaction, as opposed to just lecture and the student just takes the information in? Why do we need that reversal of the system? Why do we need that holistic approach as part of this online design? Okay, and as I said, Anderson unpacks this quite nicely for us. Okay, so we now looked at the learning theories when you engage those articles. So please, as you start reading those articles, colleagues, they are foundational articles. So you'll really start to see what, as I'm explaining, how this unpacks for you in those articles. Now let's look at the third one, colleague. The third one is open education praxis. This is something that I've been advocating for some past years. Actually, from 2016, I was seconded to the Pro Vice Chancellor's office at the University of at UNISA when we did have a Pro Vice Chancellor at PBC. And one of the things at that time was initiated was what we call the UNISA Open Learning Portal, where your course is now currently hosted. And the idea here was to create a free online course system. But you recall around 2016, 2017, the buzzword at that time was MOOCs, creating MOOCs. And everybody wanted to create a MOOC, and everybody wanted to host a MOOC internationally and benchmark it internationally. It was more prestige than anything else. And one of the challenges that we had experienced at that time was, when we talk about open education praxis, is do we have a sustainable business model to fund these things, right? Because if you want to benchmark against international universities, it is high-tech technology, high-resolution videos, high-resolution graphics. It costs a lot of money to develop these stuff. Do we have the resources into our universities to actually invest in open education if there is no sustainable business model behind it? So that was part of the problem behind it. And if you notice that if you are very familiar with the open education space, and if you're looking at some of the MOOCs that are created, a lot of them prestige universities or Ivy League universities are now offering MOOCs as part of this ways to extend their learning paradigms, their platforms to students outside or who cannot get into the university, right? So open education praxis for us is quite important, because when we start thinking about technology integration, it actually forces us to think about how we deliver teaching and learning, right? Because, for example, one of the challenges that emerges when you think about using, for example, Facebook as a way for communicating, or even WhatsApp as a way for communicating in your classroom setup, is the ability for others to tap into those spaces unless they are confined, right? So, for example, unless they are closed and you've got some restrictions on it, one of the challenges that emerged for many academics during the COVID-19 2020-21 was that when they became online, they became publicly visible, right? So the downside of that is when you become online, you become open, you become publicly visible. What does it mean for you if your content is not up to standard? What does it mean for you if your teaching approaches are not up to standard? So what does it mean for us is means quite simply in the South African context is that when we start integrating technology, we need to start discussing those critical elements of what is open education for us in our South African context. At one point, there was an open education white paper that was being discussed as part of the Department of Higher Education Training. I'm not sure how far it's gone now, because the last I heard a few years back, it was up for public critique. But the idea there is the Department of Higher Education also sees open education as a way to extend the university's teaching and learning environment beyond its traditional walls of an institution. And the two articles, one on open education and learning design, and as I said, the other one by Andrea Inamarato dos Santos on the practical guidelines on open education. So the first article actually just is, I use the first article just to set the foundation for you, but the second article is really, really cutting edge. If I cannot stress this more, is that if you want to think about what are the advantages of open education, as I unpack this now, you'll see it's much more bigger than just simply saying open education means just putting all our courses out in the open space. It goes beyond MOOCs, beyond open education resource. It's much, much more bigger debate than that. So let's look at this. How do academic staff integrate open practice in teaching and learning, right? So as information and communication technology have been integrated in higher education, we know that we're now seeing new opportunities for the proliferation, meaning the spreading of learning and teaching and dissemination of knowledge. And part of the current trends emerging in higher education is the notion of openness. what does it mean for us to be open in terms of our teaching and learning, right? Does it just mean throwing our content up in an open space where everybody can access it? Does it mean that we have open classes? It's a much, much more bigger debate than that. So what exactly does open education practice mean? So the following diagram, it represents this quite nicely, right? How do and it's taken from the first article. So it's drawn from the first article where they done a research with the faculty, and they looked at more specifically, how does or what are the benefits of open education that the faculty is actually pushing? Now, if we look at the first one, assessment, providing ways for learners to promote and share their knowledge, share their work. The good thing about that is that it allows for collaboration. The bad thing about that is, how do you then authenticate that the people that have actually done the work have actually done the work? And that's a critical element, right? So the idea of authenticating the type of collaborative work, authenticating autonomy in these spaces. The second one, an open space, is enabling new modes and mediums of learner work. And going back to what I said earlier of connectivist theory, of tapping into different mediums of gaining knowledge. And if you look at some of the spaces that the colleagues, that the students are now engaging, they are literally looking at YouTube videos. They are looking at lectures on politics, lectures on economics, lectures on Fourth Industrial Revolution, and they are drawing from those spaces into their essays, from those spaces into their teaching materials. And those are good spaces. But what it then also means is that when we become open, how open are we if we don't start to teach our students that what is authentic knowledge? How do we validate authentic knowledge, right? And that becomes quite important for us, is validating the spaces that we consider open knowledge, right? Content, reforming how we source and share content, promoting a diverse and interdisciplinary array of resources. So it means tapping into a wider spectrum of resources, a wider spectrum of what we see as content, right? And that actually is quite interesting, because if you look at how the universities are now evolving in the South African context, the entire question of indigenous knowledge systems are now becoming part of the vision, mission statements that we are foregrounding as of our universities, right? And this talks about openness. How we create open spaces to engage with those spaces that we are now considering indigenous knowledge subjects. Then you also know the discourse on decolonization, etc. And I don't need to talk to you about that, but I'm sure you're familiar with all the spaces. But how do we then, so when we talk openness, how open are we to those kind of spaces as well, right? And so you can see the discussion on openness is becoming much more critical. Learning outcomes, promoting critical approaches to knowledge, developing open and networked literacies. Now, this is quite critical, colleagues, is that the more we push technology integration in our universities, and when we talk of educational technology in higher education, we have to be practical. The more we advance technology, the greater need for a set of literacies among our students. And I'm not talking about just academic literacies. I'm talking about really core literacies in digital literacy. And sometimes we take things for granted. The assumption is that our students have access to mobile devices, our students have access to, so they can understand some of the basic things. And I can tell you for a fact, we're now actually doing a course on coding and robotics with teachers across as part of the DBE, Department of Basic Education. And what we are seeing across the country is that even our teachers that are now teaching coding and robotics, there's a level of digital literacy that needs to be in place in order for us to build anything across this country. Now, that's the exact same thing that needs to happen with our students. If our students are now getting into employment, how are we preparing our students enough by just giving them discipline knowledge and using sophisticated technology without providing them that digital literacies that they need in order to equip this, right? And this is where you need to think about as an institution in your own context, where you're coming from. How supportive are you? And we'll discuss this. I think there's one study unit that actually focuses on this. How supportive are you in developing those digital literacies, those technology literacies as part of your joint initiative to bring students on board in technology integration, right? Then teaching and learning activities, the shifting roles and responsibilities, fostering collaboration and peer review, etc. All that needs to be defined as we start thinking of openness and technology integration, right? So let us unpack some of these. Providing ways for learners to share and promote their work. This builds a sense of collaboration. Peer-to-peer learning adds values to learner's work. enabling new models and mediums, creation of new ways for learners to engage. Sorry, colleagues, I think somebody's mic is on. I'm getting some feedback somewhere. Okay, perfect. Thanks. Enabling new modes, creation of new ways for learners to engage and represent their learning and thought processes, reflecting writing, podcasts, videos, multimedia projects. And one of the things that you'll find in our next session that we want to do is I want to see what it means for us to create a podcast, right? What does it mean for us to create a video, multimedia resources? And unless you do it on your own, you will not know what a student is required to do those type of things, so the skills that are needed as part of this. So we want to flag that. Is, for example, if I ask you to create a podcast, what are the first things that you would do? Simply record it, which is one element. The format of the podcast. The second thing is, where do we host these things, right? There are tons of multiple podcast platforms on, but when you plug into a podcast platform, it also means accessibility of those platforms. So those are critical issues that we now start engaging with. Then supporting personalized learning. And this allows for learners to explore personal interests, culture, social context. And what does this mean for us within the African context when we talk about empowering learners, right? Then promote a diverse array of resources, ensures that we have opportunities for students to tap into multiple perspectives. Then promote critical approaches to knowledge, enables critical lens to knowledge production, as we spoke about earlier. Develop open and network literacies that you can review, remix, reuse. Simple process, the review, remix, reuse, the simple processes that would integrate in open education resources, OERs. And what it does is as we start forcing students to review, remix, and reuse the information that they have, they start to develop a mindset and culture that contributes towards what it means, or a type of literacy for being open learners, right? And then the shifting roles and responsibilities, the shifting roles of academics, as I mentioned earlier, the shift from a sage on the stage, the person who knows everything, the guru standing on the stage, the professor on the stage, to the facilitator of knowledge creation, where you're now co-creating knowledge, right? And the shifting roles from students from passive consumers to knowledge to active contributors in knowledge creation. And then the fostering collaboration and peer review, building knowledge together, ensuring quality processes. Then, now this is the opening up the education, open up the edu framework. And this is the one that I spoke about, which is a critical document. I cannot stress this more, that Andrea Inamarato dos Santos put together. And what I want you to do is briefly discuss what you understand by the term open education using digital technologies in this activity. And when we talk of open education using digital technologies, what's quite critical here, colleagues, is you watch the video and look at what does it mean to have open education using digital technologies? Because when it talks of openness, it also starts to bring out a conversation on what do we mean by open technologies, right? And open technologies is not just technologies that are openly accessible, meaning free to use, right? It goes beyond that to also then talk about the idea of, okay, I see there's a question. Okay, so open technologies then also goes beyond that to talk about the skills that are needed by our students. So for example, we can get the most sophisticated technologies in our institution, and if our students do not have those skills to engage with those technologies, then does it mean that we are actually open in our design of our curriculum design if we are creating stumbling blocks for our students to engage with that? So this is what it actually means by opening up the education space, opening up education using digital technologies, right? So this is a good video for you to watch. It actually starts up as setting the context for you. Then she talks about the 10 dimensions of open education, right? And this is quite critical for us, is the 10 dimensions of open education. And she starts to talk about strategy, especially strategy, technology, leadership, quality, right? The 4 outer dimensions. And then the 6 inner dimensions: content, pedagogy, recognition, collaboration, research, and access. This forms the model of what she calls the 10 dimensions of open education, right? And if we look at this 10 dimensions of open education, so access firstly means widening participation in education, right? So how do we use technology to widen participation in education? Secondly is content, open educational resources. And one of the mandates, as I said, many people are now pushing open educational resources, OERs. And remember, open educational resources are not just text-based stuff. They need to be in digital format, right? So it's multimedia resources, it's audio casts, podcasts, etc. Even going far as images that are licensed as under the Creative Commons license. Pedagogy talks of open educational practices, and then recognition, open learning, right? Collaboration involving different stakeholders, research, and this is quite critical, colleagues. I think many of you that are already publishing are well familiar with these type of issues. Strategy integrating open educational practices, open science journals, open access, open data, the Directory of Open Access Journals, the DAOJ, data list that is now being approved as and accredited by the Department of Higher Education and Training. Is how do we make sure that what knowledge we produce are openly accessible? And remember, one of the critical challenges for us in the African context is that while you publish in a lot of journals, many African universities can't afford the subscriptions for those journals. So the knowledge itself cannot reach our African context. And this is where the idea of openness in those online journal platforms, etc., becomes quite critical for us. Strategy, integrating open educational practices in core activities. And then technology, and this is quite critical, colleagues, free open source software and open document standards is how do we ensure that the type of technology that we are using are free and open source, that are accessible to our students, as opposed to being proprietary, right? So this also becomes quite critical for us when we start talking about technology and we start bringing the discourse of openness with technology. And I think this is a challenge for many of us because a lot of us are often on the issue of proprietary, thinking specifically on proprietary issues. And even our MS Teams, for example, is part of where the institutions have these collaborations with Microsoft, etc. But what does it mean for us to be truly open in terms of free open source software, right? And then quality objectives, standards and procedures, and then leadership, the top down and the bottom up kind of principles in terms of strategy development towards openness. Right? And then the learning activity 2.6. In the comments tab below, share your thoughts on how the above principles of open education can transform your teaching and learning environment within your institution. So here again, colleagues, remember, as I said, your first activity for your portfolio is actually an institutional critical reflection. So if you look at how I'm shaping these learning activities, I really want you to apply what you're learning back to your own institution so that when you are doing the portfolio, you would have already actually developed some of the content through these learning activities. And it simply means then joining the content and formulating your portfolio activity. Right? So that's how the course is actually designed. So it's a very progressive kind of engagement with your content. Okay. So before I move on to the third one, let's stop here and check where you are. So colleagues, any questions so far? What do you think so far in terms of where we are? Pedagogies, learning theories, and open praxis. Please feel free to unmute. And then what are the prospects of this for Africa? Any thoughts, colleagues? Okay, colleagues, any thoughts? Yes, John. Hi, John.
Hello, how are you?
Good, John. Nice to hear you again.
Good. Yeah, I think as we reflect to what we are talking about in terms of the implication on pedagogy and the practices, is something that if we reflect in relation to what just happened, the coming of COVID-19 and the pressure on us to finish academic years and semesters, etc. I think there's a gap. I can say there's a gap. I mean, adjustments in terms of how we deliver, in terms of curriculum, those things, to be honest, there are a few instances maybe where they were done, but we just directly, moved on with our face-to-face kind of practices and took them over to this, online and model kind of teaching and learning. So we still have got a lot of work to do in that regard if we really want this online multimodal practices to work for us.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think that's an honest reflection, John. And I think, we were forced to save the academic year, and a lot of the practices are not best practices that we did. We just kind of evolved and pushed everything overnight. And I mean, this is a major challenge for us. And I think that's a very honest reflection. Timothy, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, please. I think it's been a brilliant lecture so far, and I've taken a whole lot from it. But one of the challenges, I think, following up on John's contribution,
Mm,
is partly what we are currently experiencing, and I would like to use myself specifically as an example in this case, and hopefully link what I'm about to say with my contribution as it relates to the presentation thus far.
mm, mm,
As you may have noticed on the chart, I'd expressed my challenges with logging in onto the UNISA portal, and you have tried to offer an assistance in that, giving me direction, and other colleagues have done. And I have followed suit actually, trying to use the DUT user ID and the password provided, but I'm still struggling. I've tried it on Google Chrome and on Edge, it's not going through. And these are what our students will be confronted
mm,
with.
mm,
Should we imagine or even consider going fully online? And the challenges that comes with it, are we actually prepared as a continent to confront and deal with those challenges adequately? Then,
mm,
in terms of even the availability of data, students being able to assess some of these things, to what extent are our students competent in in maneuvering and navigating their way around all that is even laid out on the online platform? I mean, for me, there are a whole lot of layers and levels of challenges that needs to be addressed and attended to
mm,
before this can be a full-fledged reality amongst us on the continent. Otherwise, it will still be a long way and a long dream,
mm,
and we can only be taking baby steps towards it,
mm,
hoping that we will someday really get there. So,
mm.
in summary, I am still finding it difficult to still get onto Portal. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Timothy. I think, Timothy, what you do is when we finish the session, you can just drop me an email and I'll just double check the passwords, everything for you, and I can log in myself on this side and I can give you guidelines. So we can
All right.
drop that after. But I think you've captured that quite well. Is that and this is something that I also mentioned earlier uh, is the skills level, the competencies of our students, and many universities are now struggling because as we move online we are forced to literally teach twice. If I have to argue this, is you are teaching your discipline, but then you are also teaching core foundational computer skills, technology skills, and digital literacy skills. And the problem is that our academics are not equipped to provide that technical level of support even inside their modules. And our institutions have not thought about technology support, a separate department that can provide simply technology support for our students on standby. So it's a major challenge, and I think you kind of tapped it. Whether it's a dream or a reality that we are moving towards, and I think we really need to think more strategically as our institutions. Is that, and this is something that I actually said previously to our own colleagues, is that I think a cross-cutting skill of all our modules should be a technology skill. Even if it is in one of our modules and we've got something that has nothing to do with technology, the fact that we are training students on how to search for information online, that means the technology skill to search, to find information, to manage knowledge retrieval in a digital space is a cross-cutting skill. So we should actually be flagging this and starting to develop those core skills as part of it, right? And this is quite critical that we need to foreground as part of where we want to go as an institution, as institutions, as a country. We really need to think, and this is something that I also want to flag. It it's not We're not a developed country. We are really a country in an African context, which means our experiences of technology integration cannot be the developed country experiences. It is very different, which means that the way we respond to technology integration in higher education, while we benchmark ourselves internationally, we need to think of contextual relevance when it comes to these things. And that's the struggle where we find ourselves. John?
Thank you once again. Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what Timothy has said and what you are saying. I think we need to have a revamp on our curriculum and offer maybe a mandatory, what can I say, a core module, especially in the first year, or we can call it a bridging, technology course where we really introduce, especially our first years undergraduates, where we really introduce them to technology so that they know that, there's this divide between the experiences that the students have in high school and the experience that they have in university. And acclimatizing and familiarizing with the university process and how things are done at university, it's really difficult, especially for first years. So I think if we can consider some of those moves to say, let's introduce a course where we can say it's like a bridging course, because I mean, having these ICT skills, it's a must in this day and age. And also not forgetting the pool of students, where we draw our pool of students from. I mean, it's mostly rural areas and even townships. Yeah. So in the schools in townships and rural areas, you'll find that maybe one school or two schools in the whole district or province, they've got like a computer science there, or computer applications technology there. So as much as we say these young ones are digital natives, etc., but we let's contextualize it and bring it home and say, in South Africa, what are the characteristics, the attributes of our first year students in terms of where they are coming from and the skills that they should possess in order to survive in higher education.
Exactly. John, you're saying something that is actually very, very pertinent for our context. And I think that's important. I'll tell you why. As I mentioned earlier, we're training some of the teachers that are, the government has now rolled out coding and robotics, and one of across all foundation phase, first year foundation phase. And one of the things that we're now doing is train teachers. And the first course that we are actually doing is a foundational digital literacy for educators. And it actually shocked me. I'll tell you why. Is that these are students that are in the system. These are students that have come out from a grade 12 into the university. But if their teachers don't have the competencies to actually assist them with basic technology assistance, that means when they come into the university as a first year student, we assume that because they are at that age, they have access to a mobile device or whatever it is, that they have some kind of digital competency, they can engage with it. And when they come into the university, the very first problem that any university has with the very first assignment is the entire thing is plagiarized from online, right? They go online, they find information, and they go on and they plagiarize. So we know that they can find information. We know that they can access information, but we're not teaching them how to engage with knowledge retrieval. We're not teaching them with those type of critical skills. We assume those knowledge is in place. We then give them a bad report. And I mean, we're guilty of this. I mean, many of us that are sitting there, we can say that we're all guilty at some point of doing this to our students. A bad report and say, you can't plagiarize this, you get 0%. But have we ever thought to stop and say that, does a student actually know what plagiarism means in a digital space? Or is the student simply taking this information and thinking to themselves that I can just adapt it because it's online, it's available, that kind of issues, right? So there's a complete shift to the type of skills that we need if we are sharp enough to build those skills in our students at a first year. It means that by the time the student gets into the second year and a third year, they would have already adapted to those spaces. We wouldn't be doing crisis intervention as we are doing now. So somewhere along the line, we really need to rethink this and really think about building our competencies of our students right at the beginning. And opening up the space for even our students, and I said this the last time, is maybe we need to partner with, for example, DBE and say, we're getting grade 12s coming into university, but we don't have the time to train them up into the university. Can we actually train them up while you are in grade 12? And build those type of partnerships that are there. So I think this is how we really need to shift those discourses when it comes to technology integration. And I can't see technology integration in higher education without that bridging space that is happening. And we have to get back to that foundation part. So I think, John, you actually on point with that part of it. We really need to think that space. Okay, so colleagues, let's move on. We're now moving. We just got two more sub themes to talk about. And the fourth one that I now want to talk about is gamification, right? Gamification in teaching and learning online. What do we mean by gamification teaching and learning? Now, why I opted for gamification is that it's a major trend, right? And we're not talking about there's some confusion as well to it, as thinking, this is just like when you're playing a video game online, etc. No, it's applying the principles of online gaming, right, to a teaching and learning space. And we know for a fact that that this is becoming quite critical for us. It's a space for us to actually tap into, because this is where we can actually develop some of those core skills of our students. And the two articles that or the article, the first one entitled "The Model for Introduction to Gamification to E-Learning and Education." There's a few articles, but I actually thought that this was quite a nice article for a foundation, right? So the first one is defining gamification key concepts. So gamification applies elements associated with, for example, video games, and the terminologies that I use: game mechanics, game dynamics, right? In non-game applications, it aims to increase people's engagement and to promote certain behaviors. So, for example, how do we encourage students to come into an online space? Now, this for me was quite critical because, I have a 9-year-old daughter, and when one of the things that every time I pick her up, she tells me that she moved up the leaderboard in a school, in a classroom, and every time she moves up a leaderboard in a classroom, she gets points, and those points gives her at the end of a week a chocolate. Now, sometimes I think to myself, but I buy her a chocolate at the end of the week, so why is this child of mine so excited about a chocolate which he gets from school? But it's the incentivizing of her work during the week that then pushes her up a leaderboard for public acknowledgement by her peers, and the awarding of the chocolate. So it's not so much the chocolate, but it's more the process to which she reached to get that chocolate. And the same thing works with us is in higher education. How can we then bring those kind of concepts into a learning space to encourage our students to start thinking more strategically about how learning can take place in a collaborative, competitive kind of environment, right? Participatory environment, more specifically. So games can be defined as a form of play with goals and structure, right? Games can also develop problem solving and literacy skills, and good commercial games represent good learning principles that provide opportunities for gamers to engage actively and reflectively during gameplay. Now, colleagues, I must say something here as well, and going back to my earlier point, right? Maybe present learning objectives as chocolates. I think that's a good one. Give chocolates, and I know we will definitely score good marks right across. But let's look at this, right? Is that we also got to be realistic. Is that when we look at some of the universities that are able to gamify and simulate a complete environment, for some of you that are familiar with gaming world, like for example Sims, and some of these other environments that are very much simulated, that we can immerse yourself as an avatar in these environments. Those are very sophisticated spaces. The two challenges that we have is in our country is, one, we don't have the ICT infrastructure, all our institutions, to move towards that gamification space that we want. So it's a vision of where we want to go to, right? We want to see those sophisticated technology. We want to see those virtual worlds. We want to be able for a student to come in as an avatar. An avatar means a cartoon kind of created image of yourself, an animated image of yourself, walk into a university, walk around the university, engage with another avatar who is your lecturer, have a conversation with them. So virtually, you're an avatar, I'm an avatar. We can walk into this gaming world and we can converse with each other through these spaces. Those are the ideals of where we want to be. But we need to be practical at the same time. We're not there yet. We're struggling to get to that point. So when we talk of gamification, we're talking about really the nice to have and the practical of where we are at the moment, what we can bring in, right? And what we're talking now about is the elements of achievements. For example, well-known game mechanics elements such as points, levels, badges, achievements, virtual goods, leaderboards, virtual gifts, etc. So those are kind of elements that we can now start bringing into our teaching and learning, right? So for example, recently I've been doing, we just last year sometime I put in a proposal to DED for those that are familiar with the University Capacity Development Grant. and we received a grant to build up the 4IR competencies of our students across the institution. And one of the things that I'm investigating as part of that initiative is to look at how we can develop an online MOOC that is able to offer badges for our students. And the reason why we want badges as an incentive is those badges that we want to employ in this are badges that are internationally accredited. So for example, those badges that are now part of a consortium that is offering these, like Credly or Badger, that offers these badges. So on these platforms such as Credly and Badger, they have companies such as other universities. They also have companies such as Microsoft and Google, etc. So when you're offering a course as part of this, that badge that you've got as part of this, that means our students' badges are internationally recognized. That means they can take that badge, put it on their social media sites, put it wherever they want to. Those badges also serve as credit points towards what they call a learning path on these sites. So it means you can take one of the courses from UNISA, one of the courses from DUT, for example, one of the courses from Microsoft, and you can develop your own learning path, accumulative to 4 or 5 badges, and get a little certificate or whatever it is. So that's a rethinking. Remember I mentioned earlier and also last week the idea of micro-credentialing. So this opens up new possibilities for us. And the thing about technology is these badges are now digitally identifiable. So that means it's traceable to a particular individual. So you can log onto the badger ID, ID or number, and validate what that particular student learned, the learning outcomes, what were the person's marks that they achieved for it, and what set of skills they achieved for it. So that shows us a different way of integrating gaming elements as part of our teaching and learning, right? But imagine if you had a course. So imagine if I had this entire course, right? And the entire course was gamified. So that means every time you finished submit study unit 1, for example, an assignment in study unit 1, you received a badge. By the time you finish this module, you would have received 5 badges, which would have given you the learning part for completing this course, right? And that 5 badges now have an international recognition for that specific skill, that subset of skill. That's an incentive for you to work harder in this course, right? So that's what I'm talking about, colleagues, is the rethinking, the repackaging of how we actually think of incentivizing our students. Now, I can tell you this from our UNISA context. I'm trying from something from my own context. Is over the years, we struggled for online participation. We have almost 450,000 students, and our online participation stats of students are very low, right? And the reason why it's so low is because we do not incentivize online participation, right? If you do not incentivize online participation, if you do not incentivize anything that is technology integrated, it becomes for many of our students just as ad hoc that they can do without. And that shows that they do not necessarily need to engage within the system. So this is where the gaming element for us becomes quite critical. And maybe you need to also think about it, is to really think about engaged learners, online engaged, digitally engaged learners. And this type of incentive system of badges, virtual goods, leaderboards, etc., are gaming elements that creates that dynamic flow towards that spaces, right? Gamification provides accelerated feedback, clear goals, and challenging tasks. Gamification has some common elements, for example, the behaviors learning theory, like recalling superiority of reinforcements, etc. Stimulus, remember those kind of things that we spoke about a little earlier. And the essence of gamification does not lie just in technology, but the diverse learning environment and the system of decisions and rewards. And this is important, the learning decisions and rewards that aim to increase motivation, reaching higher levels of engagement in the learning process. That motivation to climb higher, that motivation to move higher as part of this. And the success, when you move into a new space, you've achieved that level, and we call this leveled up, right? So you leveled up onto the next level. And that actually shows us the kind of levels of skills that we have. So we have a foundational skill for our student. Once they complete that skill, they level up into the next level of skills, right? So it's a different system, different mindset, but also some of our students have already been exposed to this. I mean, if you look at some of the students who are engaged in gaming worlds, PlayStation, the rest of the stuff, these are principles that are already applied in those gaming worlds. So it's adapting some of those principles into our teaching and learning environment. Now, what I would like to do is to watch this video below and then unpack what the concept gamification means. And similar to what I just discussed, they unpack that nicely. Then the benefits of gamification, the following are notable benefits of gamification: properly developed e-learning, which uses gamification, increased satisfaction, engagement, effectiveness, efficiency of students, motivation, engagement of students in learning online, gamification, properly developed e-learning. Now, this is quite critical. It forces us to rethink how we design our curriculum. And one of the things that we force us to rethink is learning outcomes is critical, because you're now matching your content to a specific learning outcome, to a specific goal in that game as part of this gamification space, right? So the rethinking of our curriculum design, instructional design, becomes more critical for us now when we start moving into this space. Games typically allow players to restart, play again, making mistakes recoverable. Now, this is, for me, is one that we should actually flag quite critically for us in the African context. Now, remember, in a gaming world, it doesn't matter how well versed you are in technology, how well versed you are in the game. Everybody starts the game at level 1, right? Playing, for example, let me give you a typical example. For those that played Mario Brothers at some time, every player, the moment you switch that game on for the first time, you start that game at level 1 and you move up. It doesn't matter if you are well versed with other games. When you're playing that Mario game, you start at the same level that even a person who never played Mario Brothers before, they will also start at the same level. So what does that mean for us in terms of our equity of our students? It allows all our students to start on the same space without giving preference to any student, right? But then it allows those students that are working much faster to work at their own pace and work faster. But it allows those students who have not been familiar not to feel that they are behind. They work at their own pace because they know they all start together. And as they fail, they come back and they experiment and move forward again, right? So that kind of principles of equity and distributed learning comes quite critical for us as part of this, right? Well-designed educational games can offer opportunities for play improvement, massive amounts of feedback, tasks too complex for any one individual to solve alone, and environments that change in response to learners' action. Remember, in some situations, the players can also have what we call dual players, 2 or 3 players as part of this, right? Collaborative learning. That's the idea, right? Then next video, watch this video on discuss 4 techniques, elements in gamification. And here it talks about the gratification of gaming, the gaming techniques, and what can be used, right? Then colleagues, gamification online learning, right? And this is the model that is being proposed by the colleagues that in the reading that you have. Is the main elements are management of e-learning, important factors in e-learning, elements of user experience, phases of development, analysis, planning, development, implementation, evaluation, game mechanics, game dynamics, game elements in e-learning, and their effects on the students. So we look at these and how it fits in, the analysis, the planning, development, implementation, evaluation. It is really, I'm taking a group of people now when we are actually designing a MOOC on digital literacy for our students, and we're trying to gamify the entire MOOC, right? And we're now moving into an area of just thinking of gamification, but in addition to thinking of point system and badges, it's allowing us the opportunity to create a complete African virtual environment. And the kind of team that I'm working with are interdisciplinary, so they're academics from different colleges, but they are working in a very unique space in the sense that they are Africanizing the gaming elements, the digital literacy MOOC. So, for example, they got characters that are representative of of something that they call the African Murula kind of environment, etc. So the idea of creating a unique African identity between these things, and that allows us now to actually, and this is why I say context, even when we think of gamification, context, what our students can associate with in these technology spaces. When we talk about avatars, it doesn't mean that we should have an avatar that the student cannot associate with. It's creating those association elements even in a gamification world as well. And that gives us quite an interesting space for. Okay, and then if you look at game dynamics, the learning elements, right? So game dynamics, points, badges, levels, challenges, game dynamics, rewards, statuses, self-expression, competition, motivation. So these are the core elements that comes out as part of the gamification theory. Now, remember, colleagues, these are all opportunities that this technology is creating for us. A sophisticated learning management system like Moodle, for some of you that have, can offer badges, can offer some of these elements that we are talking about. In addition, we have plugins that are available to reinforce these kind of environments. And many of these learning management systems that we now have caters for that third-party plugins, etc., that creates that space for us to engage in much more collaboratively. So gamification, the research agenda for us in the African context, is that it offers us new opportunities for us to engage in student experiencing of learning in higher education, as focused on student characteristics such as conceptions of learning, context, methods, learning context, etc., the quality of learning. So there's a very strong research agenda that forms part of this contextual instructional design in gamification, right? So let's look at our last theme. Our last theme is quite an interesting theme because you see that I've been building it up from pedagogy to learning theories to open praxis, then to gamification. And in all those 4 phases that I've just discussed, the one important thing that comes out is data. In all those 4 elements, you've got access to massive data that you can now use to assess different elements of your student environment, right? Pedagogy, to see how your students are studying, how your students are your learning patterns of your students' behavior. Gamification, how your students are competing in these spaces, the time they spend in these spaces. And this big data, however you pronounce it, in higher education offers new opportunities for us to start to understand, and that's what data helps us understand, right? Big data gives us a much more bigger space to tap into higher education. Now, we already know that, I mean, this is nothing new in the other industries. Entertainment industry is using it, all the other industries are using it. But what exactly is big data, right? And the definition by Doug and Laney is that it talks about the V's, and there's a 5th V which the video below talks about, right? So the 4 V's that they talk about is the increasing size of data, volume, the increasing rate at which it is produced, mined, and analyzed, velocity, the increasing range of sources, formats, and representation, variety, the widely different quality of data sources, coverage, accuracy, and timelessness of data, veracity. So the 4 V's, that's how they describe big data. But the video below, which I then gave you, what is interesting is they added a 5th element, the value element, right? So there's a 5th element called value. 4 there plus 5 value. This is a good way for us to understand what does big data mean for us. Now, they also, when you watch this video, it is briefly explain what you understand by the term big data, analyze it. So this video actually it puts that in context, summarizes it quite nicely for you on how big data. And it talks about the idea that, previously we didn't know, for example, we couldn't project when hurricanes are happening, when tornadoes are happening. Now with data, we are actually able to prepare in advance for some of these natural disasters, right? So the big data actually helps us to engage in this environment. Think about high-risk modules, for example. With big data over the past couple of years, you are able to analyze it and pick up students' trends. And this is what becomes quite critical for us. What do we do with those big data in our institutional context? And then identify the following reasons big data are important in higher education. Firstly, individualizing a student's path to content mastery through adaptive learning or competency-based education, better learning as a result of faster and more in-depth diagnosis of learning needs, cause trouble spots, including assessment of skills such as system thinking, collaboration, problem solving, in context of deep and authentic subject area knowledge assessments, targeted interventions to improve student success and to reduce overall cost to students and institutions, to remember throughput, which is our primary aim at institutions, and then using game-based environments for learning and assessment where learning is situated in complex information decision-making situations. So it kind of helps us to project these things. And one of the things that we know that sustainable models for institution, throughput, pass rate and throughput is important for us in any institution to survive, higher education to survive. If we have the data to project these things, then we have the data to actually develop the interventions to assist our students with these things, okay? Big data, the science of learning, analytics, and transformation in education. I found this fascinating video at Stanford University, delivered by Candice Tilley on unpacks the importance of big data in transforming education, right? And she describes how, for example, simple things like your ability to now reflect on your curriculum, on your content, right? becomes quite important as part of revising your curriculum, revising your content. That data actually helps you. So watch this video and look at how she unpacks, right? And then below, describe how this can be contextualized in your own institution, teaching and learning environment, right? So what does that big data mean for you in your own institution, right? And then the latter part of this here talks about now the challenges and future directions of big data and artificial intelligence. And here it's the idea of policy, industry, and research, right? And this is quite a nice diagram that the authors of that article pick up. I thought it actually is a good summation of what do we mean by the challenges and future directions of big data and artificial intelligence, AI more specifically. So big data and education research, in the first kind of research, education is progressively moving from one size fits all approach to precision education or personalized learning. So it's customized, personalized, right? Then research focuses on deploying all AI education, gradually shifting from computational focus to cognitive focuses, incorporating cognition in design, perception, emotion, cognitive thinking, as we saw earlier. The format of machine-generated data also becomes quite critical here. Machine learning algorithms, etc. There are also ethical and algorithm challenges. For example, when we balance human-provided learning and machine-assisted learning. So, for example, those are critical issues, right? That drives the research agenda. Then the biasness of algorithms that are in place, a controversial issue, and here that is quite critical is when we start flagging students for high-risk modules based on simple behavior when it may not necessarily be the case in all other modules, right? So there's also that issue of the biasness of an algorithm in the big data analysis. Then the fast expansion of technology and inequalities of learning opportunities as well as great controversies. Then big data and AI education policy making. In digitally driven knowledge economies, traditional formal education systems are undergoing drastic change or even what we call a paradigm shift. What does this mean for solutions for integrating cutting-edge research findings, innovative theory-driven curricula, and emerging technologies in student learning and evidently beneficial for perhaps even greater ready adoption, right? Now, remember the earlier discussion that we had is that while we were all forced to make the jump towards technology integration, our pedagogies were simply classroom pedagogies, face-to-face pedagogies adapted in an online space. But that's not teaching in an online environment. That's not integrating technology. That's not extending our learning environment. So those are kind of policies that now need to redefine, evaluate how we are actually teaching in these online spaces. Then industry, commercializing intelligent educational tools. And this is quite critical for us because when we start talking about commercializing, what we are talking about here, colleagues, is cost to institution. The big data that we receive and we start analyzing, companies start to make competitive tools for us to work with. Do we really have the funds in the African context to start tapping into these commercially driven as opposed to freely available tools? Right, and for me that's a big challenge for us because if we look at some of these companies that are providing services to many of our institutions, they're doing it at a very large amount of money, which means that to sustain some of these technology integrations in our university is going to be a major challenge for us unless we start thinking of sustainable business models for educational technology in our education. Possible solutions. And here's a mind map, kind of like a table put forward by the colleagues, and I'm not going to go forward to the whole thing, but this is something that you can look at. For example, policy methods, new methods of instruction, engagement, assessment will need to be developed. It kind of shows us where our gaps are and what are the possible solutions that we need to start thinking. And I thought that when I saw this table, I thought it's actually a good way for us to start the conversation in our institutions around technology integration, because this actually flags it quite nicely for us to say these are the gaps that we are actually facing if we have to be real in the African context as well. And then some of the solutions of how we can rethink these type of spaces. So colleagues, those are the 5 themes that forms the basis of this particular study unit. And those readings that I've just summarized now or identify the key points for that you need to go back and look at more carefully so that you can understand how those readings now fit into the bigger picture. Then remember I mentioned to you that after every study unit, you have a portfolio activity, right? So that means this activity now goes into your portfolio, right? So remember, this is not a separate activity. It is a portfolio activity, right? So it means all your portfolio activities, so it means your portfolio activities for these remaining study units will be collated and put into one document, one portfolio, and submitted as an assignment 2. So for this portfolio activity, this is what I want you to do, right? So your second assignment is a portfolio. In each of your remaining study units, you receive a portfolio activity. You need to complete these activities and submit them all, please, colleagues, by 24th November. But if you're working more than that advanced, then please feel free to send it, right? In this study unit, you have been introduced to various pedagogies, learning theories, and key trends in educational technology and higher education. You are required to write a reflective essay. Reflective essay. Now, remember, I told you throughout this, all the learning activities was forcing you to reflect on how these pedagogies, technologies on your own institution. So what I want you to do as part of reflective essay is on how these approaches could be integrated in your institution's teaching and learning environment, right? Reflect back on your own institution. You do not need to write on all the themes covered. So, for example, you don't need to cover gamification, pedagogy, learning theories. I think that's a bit too much to cover in one essay with just 1,500 words or so. So what I suggest that you do is you choose one of them, right? Choose one of them, and then you write on one specific one that you want to. So you have a choice. So you can choose any one of the themes covered, and you can choose one of them and then write a detailed reflection on how the pedagogy, learning theory, or key trend can be integrated in your own institution. The aim of this essay is to assess how you contextualize and apply the knowledge you have just gained, right? Instructions, exact same instructions, colleagues, as you did for your blog. So academic rigor, referencing format, length is the same. Remember, this contributes the balance 20% towards your portfolio mark, right? And the criteria is all the same as your blog. So I try to keep it the same criteria because the idea of the blog was to get you adapted to this kind of rubric that we're working to. So I'll use the same rubric as we go throughout. So it's exact same criteria as the blog, the rubric, and you work towards. So that's the essay question, colleagues, for a portfolio question that's your first portfolio question, right? On specifically on this study unit on the designs, theoretical principles for designing education technology and interfaces in higher education. So colleagues, that brings us to the end of study unit 2. Next week, Friday, we will discuss study unit 3. And study unit 3, colleagues, will now move us more into some of the application of some of these innovative principles that we now design. And we want to do some of the kind of say, okay, how do we actually apply some of these things? What does it mean for us in our own institutional context? When we start thinking of that these are nice to have principles for designing, these are nice to have strategies, but what does it really mean when we start designing these things for us in our own institutional context? So for example, if you are to design an online activity, what does an online activity consist of when you start designing? We start moving into those kind of elements. So colleagues, that brings me to the end of today's session. We've got a few minutes. Let me open up for any questions or any comments. Professor Maposa, please, the floor is yours. I think you just need to unmute. Is he still mute?
Thank you for the nice presentation. I think, yeah, it really make us is actually in linking well to the other modules that we've done, and also in the future that we are going to do about portfolio. Also, I was also thinking that since you have given us the link there, we will also try to go there. But I think as a class rep, I'm also suggesting that you may also send to the emails again to like you did last time.
Okay.
What we covered today.
Okay, no, perfect. I'll send the readings as well. I can download and send it to as well.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Any other comments, colleagues, questions? Are you all comfortable with the portfolio question, the first one? I don't see anything else. I don't see anything in the chat. Let me see the chat. Okay, nothing in the chat. So perfect. So colleagues, thank you very much. So colleagues, if you are, okay, let me see. I think Timothy, the floor is yours. Timothy, carry on.
With the portfolio question, I'm not very clear with it, and the problem is that I don't know what I'm not clear about. But in summary, what would be the length of this particular question, and how many of such questions do we expect again before the completion of the portfolio?
Okay, so remember this. Okay, so remember, yeah, you need to. Okay, you covered the pedagogies, the learning theories, you covered open praxis, you covered gamification, and you covered big data, right? So what I want you to do is any of those 5 to reflect on that critically. So it means reflect on it and write what does it mean for you in your own institution, but specifically in your teaching and learning environment, right? Your requirements here is similar to the last one, 1,200 to 1,500 words. Now remember, your word count is matched to the percentage of this. So for example, your blog was 20%, so you got a similar word count, right? Your next one, which is on the technology part of it, is also 20%, similar word count. Then the last 2 ones are actually much smaller. The smaller ones are actually much smaller than this. It's actually both those last 2 study units would be accumulated to this year. So it's much smaller component of it. And then the last thing that I wanted you to do was, which will be an additional one, is what I call a learning journal, for you to reflect on your learning process, on what this actually means for you when you went through this journey as part of it. We call it a learning journal process, which actually helps you to reflect on your own individual journey through this itself. So yeah, so so you've just got this one at 1,200 words, the next study unit at 1,200 words, then study unit 4 and 5 are smaller, and then the conclusion journal is a bit smaller.
All right. Thank you so much, please.
Pleasure. We'll see next.
Snake. Okay, yeah. I left the class last week very early, and that might explain why I might be asking you a question now about the blog. Where do we access the blog, and how do we go about it?
Okay, the blog. Okay, so have you joined this? Have you signed up here onto this learning platform that I'm working through?
Yes.
Okay, so if you go to study unit 1, right? Study unit 1. Remember, study unit 1. At the end of study unit 1 is the blog assessment, right? Okay. And at the blog assessment in the bottom, it gives you the instruction of what you need to do. But remember, I said that if you're familiar with the blog space, so you can actually use one of the blogging platforms. One of the colleagues used a Facebook platform and shared me the Facebook link. So you're free to use that. If you're not too familiar with that, then you're welcome to also, as long as it's in a blogging format, that means you're writing towards a blogging audience, you can even send me in a Word document and PDF, and we will upload it, right? So when you submit your assignment, upload it here. Click here. For the colleagues that already submitted to me, don't worry about it. I will upload it here for you, right? So your blog question is here, and you submit it on the space.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Professor Maposa, is that a historical or a new question?
No, it's not very historical. But I wanted to say, there was always a debate about when we say 1,000, about 1,500 words. In terms of pages, is approximately how many?
When I looked at this, it says about 400 words per page. So you're looking about 3 to 4 pages.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, colleagues, any other questions? Nothing else? Okay, I don't see any other ends. I don't see any other comments. Perfect. Okay, so colleagues, please, for those that can't access this platform, that are struggling to access it, whether it's a password or whatever it is, please email me so I can cross-check your login details and I can make sure everything is working and I can guide you with that. But we cross-check almost everything this morning, so I'll just double-check it for you when you send me your details if you have any challenges with it. But please remember, the reason why I'm using this approach as opposed to just giving you the information is that I want you to see what an online course looks like, how to actually engage with the online space. But also, this gives you a central platform that you can use at. So, for example, if you're sitting at a coffee shop and you just pick up your phone and you can log on and access the data. That's the idea of learning that's open learning on the move as well. So, colleagues, by next week Friday, what I normally do, colleagues, is I allow you flexibility time to go through this. I don't want to overwhelm you. Next week Friday, early morning, I then release the next study unit. So study unit 3 will be released next week Friday. What I will also do, colleagues, is I will set up the recording for today's session. I'll actually upload it I'll create a link here on webinar recordings and upload it here for you as well, so that if it's on YouTube and it's playing inside, you still don't get charged for it. So it makes it a bit less costly for you. So I'll upload the recording for this, but I don't have the recordings for the last week's session, unfortunately. If I can get that, then I will upload it here for you as well. But you will get today's recording for those that may have missed it, full thing on the site itself. And yeah, so colleagues, it's been great being with you, and I hope you are really engaging with this course as we are going on and learning some stuff. But please go through the readings, etc., and we will catch up with each other next week. Remember, on Wednesday, if you want to chat anything between 6 to 7 on Wednesday, please feel free to jump onto our WhatsApp group and chat, because that's the time that we made available. So you can just jump in and chat with us. And yeah, so if you have any problems, anything of that sort, we can fix it up in that space, or any clarity that you need. Other than that, colleagues, I wish you all the best. Hope you have a great weekend, and take care of yourself, and please be safe. And we'll catch each other next week. Thanks, colleagues.
Thank you, Prof.